This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. For Americans and those familiar with the American Southwest, a winter scene of native peoples with teepees can become commonplace. Yet it can also elicit wonder, awe, and curiosity. And such is the case with this painting by Edward Berninghaus. When it arrived at the studio, it was clear that this painting had a rough life. It was flaking throughout the sky. There was heavy craquelure that was indicative of lots of expansion and contraction of the canvas. It had been worked on in the past and cropped down. 1 full inch was folded over, presumably to fit a frame. The painting was covered with an old varnish, and there were areas of retouching that were visible to the naked eye. In addition, during the past conservation attempt or cleaning, some of the paint was abraded or skinned, leaving scars or white areas. This scene, which is so integral to the story of America, deserves better than this. It deserves to be cared for with respect, dignity, honor. It deserves to be glorious, to capture our imagination. It deserves to honor the work of the artist and the people in the painting. And that is our task at hand. So who was Oscar Berninghaus? Well, he was one of the 6 members of the Taos Society of Artists, founded in 1915. This group of painters, led by Joseph Henry Sharp and Irving Kaus, became so enamored with the Taos Valley in New Mexico that they decided to stay there and set up a studio with a focus on depicting the natural lives of the Native Americans living in the region and the beautiful landscape. This group of artists sought to define a new American painting. Just a few years after their founding, the group was sending traveling exhibits all across the United States. On the East Coast, the initial critical reaction was that the works were unrealistic and overdone, too vivid, too emotionally evocative, and just not authentic. These artists challenged the critics, saying that they had never seen the Southwest desert nor the Taos Pueblo. To this day, their legacy lives on in galleries and museums all over the country and world, and in the Taos Art Colony, which has been instrumental in creating a multicultural tradition of art throughout the area. Now, it's no accident that their work garnered attention. These guys were masters of defining their own narrative, which is something that every artist needs to take control of. And there's no easier way than with a website by Squarespace. By answering a few questions, Squarespace will get you up and running with a website in seconds. You can choose from thousands of professionally designed website templates that work everywhere: desktop, mobile devices, tablets, you name it. And with Squarespace, getting your art to the world doesn't require you to crate it up and send it halfway across the country. And hopefully you won't run into harsh critics, but if you do run into some bumps, Squarespace has you covered with online tutorials and a robust forum full of people just like you there to help out. So head over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Baumgartner to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Now that we know a little bit about who Berninghaus was, what he was painting, and why, let's turn our attention to the painting itself. The first thing that I need to do is remove the painting from the stretcher, and I'll do that by pulling out all of these tacks. The multiple tack holes is another indication that this painting has been resized. You can see that the tacking edge is pretty frayed, and that's from a lot of handling and wear and tear, and that will all have to be addressed. Now you can see here where the painting overlaps the stretcher, and that's going to be a problem that we have to deal with, not only on the painting itself, but with this support. I'm careful to remove this painting from the support because it is fragile and it does have some flaking areas. I'm going to disassemble this support, take the keys out, and place it aside for later when we will inevitably have to figure out a solution for it being undersized. I'm going to dust off the back of this canvas, and I'm going to do it while I'm holding the canvas in the air. There's not a lot of grime and dirt here, and I don't want to put it face down and use the vacuum for fear that it may cause some of that paint to flake. I certainly could face the painting with Kozo like I've done in the past, but I don't really need to because I'm going to go right to the hot table and do a treatment to start stabilizing this lifting paint layer and distorted canvas. I'm careful to unfold the tucked over and cropped off canvas, and then I will tape down the Mylar film, create an airtight envelope, extract the air, create some vacuum pressure, and then using heat and a dampened blotter paper, I can start to bring down those distortions. I'll use a piece of balsa wood to rub over the surface of the painting and encourage some of that paint that's lifting up to go down flat. Where I need some more persuasion, I'll use a bone folder. And where I need even more persuasion, I will use an oak roller. And this allows me to exert some force on the canvas without damaging it, because I'm not abrading or scraping the surface of the paint. I'm doing this all through the Mylar film, which protects that paint layer. I'm going to spend some time working this edge to get it as flat as possible, because even though the vacuum pressure does a lot, a little bit of extra attention goes a long way. After the treatment is complete, I'll place the painting underneath some weights and some sheetrock and blotter paper, and then leave it in my studio for a couple of days. When it's done, I can remove the felt that protects the paint layer, and I can see that it's all flat and much of those distortions are gone. But the paint layer is still unstable. Just because we've gotten it down and flat doesn't mean that it's not going to flake off in the future. And so I'm going to go behind me to my little spray room for the next treatment, the adhesive impregnation. Onto the back of this canvas, I'm going to be rolling out a heated up and thinned out conservation adhesive. This is a flexible and reversible archival adhesive, and the whole point here is to penetrate through the canvas, saturate the canvas, and up into the voids wherever the paint is flaking or potentially going to flake. I want this adhesive to go there. I'll let the adhesive dry, let some of the solvent evaporate, and then I can start working on making this treatment complete and really bonding down this flaking paint to the canvas. It's necessary to allow that solvent to evaporate so that we just have the adhesive. Once that has evaporated and it's cool, I can take the painting over to the hot table, which has already been heated up to the activation temperature of the adhesive, and lay it face up. Now this is on top of a siliconized release film, and I'm putting another one on top of the painting so that nothing sticks to it and the painting doesn't stick to the table. I'll then cover it with the Mylar as I did before, and then using through bag connectors, I will extract the air from this envelope that I have taped down. These little connectors allow me to pull the air out, and they're used in carbon fiber and fiberglass production, but they're really useful here. I'll use a little piece of felt just to give it a little bit of pressure and not burn my hand, and then the hot table does its thing. Once the treatment is complete, I can then begin the cleaning process. Now, I don't have to worry about any of the paint flaking off because of the adhesive impregnation treatment. It's bonded all of that paint, the stuff that was flaking, and even the stuff that I didn't know yet was flaking, back down to the canvas. And I'm using a solvent mixture that I have mixed up based on my initial testing to remove this discolored natural resin varnish. Natural resin vanishes discolor over time. The artists often don't know this or don't expect it or just don't really care because they'll be gone when this eventually needs to be conserved. But we do want to remove it. Now, one of the things that I'm seeing as I remove this old varnish, aside from all of these really beautiful pastel colors, is some areas of very extreme overpaint. Now, this is certainly not as extreme as many of the things I have seen, but I can't imagine that those 3 spots on the top edge are conservative, accurate, or even all that necessary. You can see them, which is a fundamental problem for retouching. The whole point is that you shouldn't be able to see them. And I'm going to have to deal with them later. But for now, I'm going to continue on cleaning this painting. And actually, as you can see, removing the old discolored varnish does have an appreciable effect. Sometimes I don't notice how drastic the change is until I am looking at the video of the work that I have just done. Sometimes you have to take a step back to see the work. When you're in it, you just can't see it. I'm so focused on the minutia of the cleaning, looking at the different colors, making sure that the paint is stable, that I sometimes can't see the change happening right in front of my eyes. And that's one of the neat things about filming all of this process, is that I get to go back and re-experience the cleaning process, and sometimes for the first time. And it's oftentimes really, really exciting. I get to be a witness to my work, which is kind of neat. Now, if removing the discolored varnish wasn't terribly dramatic in the sky, well, it is in the foreground. Removing a slightly discolored yellowed varnish from a yellow sky, well, not that big of a difference. But removing it from bright white snow, big difference. And it matters. The whole tone and tenor of the painting changes. The temperature of the painting changes. And I don't mean hot, cold, it's going to burn me. I mean, the colors that the artist used here were cool. These blues, these purples, but the natural resin varnish gives them a warm tone, and that changes how the whole painting feels. It changes the time of day this painting may have been created. With that warm tone, maybe it's the golden hour, but when we see these cool colors in the snow, maybe it's high noon, and we can feel that cold in the scene. So these subtle changes actually do matter, not only to what the artist intended us to see, but how we perceive the whole painting, how we understand the scene, how we feel it. And really, that matters. Because if this painting had a warm tone to it, maybe we would think different about the lives that these people had lived or the hardships that they faced. But with this cold tone, well, maybe it's a little bit more acute that this was not an easy place to be. With the varnish removed, I'm going to focus on removing the grime and old varnish from that edge of the painting that was folded over. This is going to take a little bit more work, and I'm starting off with a neutral organic soap to remove the accumulated dust and dirt and grime. This probably has never been cleaned, and you can see that it is really, really dirty. So removing all of this grime allows me to remove then any varnish layer that may have been on this painting when it was first varnished. Luckily, we can see that it does come up clean. Now, there is some staining from exposure to a frame, but we'll deal with that later. I've left the signature for last, and here I'm using a resin soap, which is an alternative to free solvents or liquid solvents. It does much of the same thing, but it is a little bit more controlled, and for really delicate areas like signatures, it's often my preferred approach. By using something that's much more mild, so to speak, or slow acting, I can really control how exposed the often delicate signature is to the solvents or to the gel, and make sure that none of it is lifted off or damaged. This is certainly possible with free solvents, but I have other approaches that can guarantee it. And now onto all of that overpaint. Here I'm using a gelled solvent to slowly break down the top layer of overpaint. And the reason that this gelled solvent doesn't attack the original paint is that the original paint is more oxidized than the retouching because it's older. And so this solvent gel will attack the top layer, the less oxidized paint. Now, if I leave it on for long enough, it theoretically could damage the original paint, and that's why I won't leave it on for very long. In addition, I need to get rid of some of this fill-in because it's standing proud of the surface and it has no texture, so it reads as fill-in. I'll use a scalpel to do it, and then I can start putting this painting back together. Because one of the edges was folded over and because the others are a little threadbare, I'm doing a reinforcement because I want to make sure that this crease doesn't tear in the future. I'm not lining the painting because that's really invasive for the level of damage that this canvas has. I like to be as conservative as possible and only address what's necessary. And so by lining the whole painting, well, it would be excessive, and I don't want to do that. Now on the other edges, I'm doing a strip lining, and I'm adding a piece of Belgian linen canvas to that tacking edge so that I have more meat when I need to stretch it. I'm going to apply a little bit of ground to this raw canvas area where the fill-in was, just so that I can ensure that my fill-in will stick and won't flake off in the future. In addition, I'll apply this ground to the raw canvas areas on the piece of canvas that was folded over when it was cropped. For the stretching, I have turned to a stock of old stretcher parts that I keep in the studio, abandoned pieces, things we've taken off of other projects, and I found two pieces that actually are the identical size of the painting in its original form. They're old and they fit perfectly, so not only do they look the part, but they will be adequate in support. I've married those with the two shorter members of the original stretcher, and I am now going to go ahead and start tacking this painting on. I start in the center of each edge to create a taut area in the middle of the painting, and then I can work from the center out. This is a common technique in stretching canvases, both before they're painted and after they're painted, and really what we're trying to do here is to get even pressure across the entire painting and not get any ripples. I'll remove these nails that I put in to square up the stretcher. I'll fold over the tacking edge, tack it down, and tidy it up. These little finishing touches are one of my favorite parts of the entire project. It just makes me feel good, and I enjoy doing it. I also think that it's a testament to good quality of work, not only in the front, but the back. Sometimes the stuff that you don't see, well, it tells you about the care taken with the stuff you can see. After stretching come the keys, and these will expand these non-glued joints of the stretcher and add a little bit of tension by making the stretcher slightly larger. To ensure that these keys don't come loose and become lost or get trapped between the stretcher bar and the canvas and create a bump or a dent, I will bind them in place with some fishing line and a tack. And that's that. Once the painting has been stretched and keyed out, I can then start filling it in. Remember, I put that ground down so that this fill-in medium would bond really well? Well, it's important because I don't want any of this hard work to flake off. I'll use a palette knife to fill in the area, and then because there's texture in the sky, that's the impasto, the brushwork of the artist, I'll use a brush to mimic it. It's not terribly complicated on a painting like this. Sometimes it can be really, really difficult to match the texture. But here, it's really loose and free-flowing, so I have a little bit of liberty and a huge margin for error. After all of that fill-in is dry, I can remove the excess. It's necessary to remove all of the stuff that's covering the original paint because I don't want to overpaint. Unlike the person who did this before, it's not going to be acceptable for me to just cover up a large swath of this painting with overpaint because it is easier. I'm going to remove all of this fill-in so that I'm limited to retouching just the areas of loss. Now here, I'm going to be putting down an isolation layer for a couple of reasons. One, it's going to help me match the colors better. Two, it's going to give me a good surface to work on. And three, I think it's going to enable me to avoid having to put a final varnish down. This, in fact, is the final varnish that I normally use. But instead of retouching first and then varnishing it, I'm putting it down now, and then I'm going to retouch on top of it. And not only is that a completely valid approach, it's one that we often use here in the studio. When the retouching is not expansive and doesn't need the combination of an isolation layer and a final varnish, putting down the final varnish layer and retouching atop of it works fine, and it saves time. And sometimes that really matters. Now I'll answer a question that I know that you are already ready to ask. What about the UV stability of the retouching paints if they're not underneath that UV stable varnish? Well, these retouching paints, which are designed for conservation and mixed with a synthetic resin instead of an oil, which makes them reversible, also makes them archival because that resin is UV stable. So even though this retouching medium, this paint that I'm applying right now, is sitting on top of the varnish layer, it also is UV stable. So it doesn't need to be underneath. Now, one of the tricks to retouching atop a varnish is the sheen and managing the glossiness. You can see that the paint that's already been varnished has a pretty high gloss to it. It's catching the light at the high points of the impasto. The retouching medium that I use, this paint, is mostly matte. There are additives, however, some resins that we can mix in that will bring the gloss level up. There is no perfect ratio, and you just kind of have to experiment around with it. But making sure that this has the same sheen as the varnish is going to be critically important, in the same way that making sure the texture matches. Color matching is not necessarily the hardest part of retouching. Yes, it is difficult, but you do it enough and you kind of become automatic at it. Texture matching and sheen matching is really difficult, because even sometimes when you think you've got it, you turn around and, well, the sheen's a little off. It's a little too shiny or a little too matte. And then it gives away the retouching. So you have to adjust it. Same thing with the texture, which is why I spent time adding texture to this fill-in, so that when it's all done and we look at the painting from the side or a raking light, we don't see a smooth surface. We see an area with brushwork, impasto, texture, and it blends in. And so adding the additional resin to this paint is a way that I'm going to try to match the sheen, again, so that when we look at it, not necessarily head on, but from the side or, glancing at it, we don't see an area that's extra shiny or extra matte, because that, of course, would give away that this is an area of retouching and damage. And for this client, they did not want any evidence of the damage. Some clients may choose a technique that allows us to respect the damage while camouflaging it, but most of them don't want to see this stuff. They want the painting to be put back together. And if they really, really do want to see the areas of retouching, well, they can use an ultraviolet light to reveal them, because all of the materials I use are designed to fluoresce under UV light. The fluorescence of the paint under UV light not only keeps the conservator honest, because we can see where we've retouched. So if I were to use a big brush and just glaze in the entire sky, well, everyone would see it. But it also allows us to see what needs to be removed in the future if we so desire to remove it. Now, in an area like this, where I'm trying to reintegrate a part of the painting that was really damaged, it was folded over, it was probably stained by exposure to the frame that it was in, the tannins in the wood can discolor the paint layer, it's a little bit more tricky. I need to do a lot more retouching, and I have to blend the part of the painting that wasn't folded over with the part that was, because they're not the exact same. This is a little different than just retouching a tear or a gap in the paint. Because the area that was folded under is a little bit darker, I have to kind of marry them, and that means, well, kind of finding a way to bridge those differences without doing too much retouching on the original. Luckily, there is a lot of color on this painting. It's not just a flat color of green. There's pinks and oranges, browns and yellows and whites and blues. So there's a lot going on, even though it looks like a pretty simple sky, which is something that works in my favor, because the more colors, the more texture, the more brushwork, the more that's happening, the easier it is for me to disguise the work that I'm doing. The hardest thing to retouch is a completely flat, smooth, single color field on a canvas with no texture. Just about anything you do is going to be visible in some light, because really the light changes the way that we see this. In warm light, something like a 2700 Kelvin light bulb, this retouching may look perfect, but in really cool light, something like a 5000 Kelvin bulb, it may be off. So I use adjustable LED panels to compensate for the varying light that comes into my studio during the day, during different times of the week, or during different times of the year. In addition, all of my lights in my studio are calibrated to an even set Kelvin so that I can ensure I have unified light source across the entire studio. Now, that doesn't guarantee anything, and when I do work for museums or institutions that have control over their lighting, I will often ask what Kelvin or temperature they're using in the gallery so that I can set my lights to that Kelvin, and then try to ensure that my retouching will look the same in my studio and out on location. Unfortunately, sometimes you have no control. This area on the horse was abraded during the past cleaning. It was one of the things that I noticed when I took the painting in. It just means that whoever cleaned this painting was a little too aggressive, maybe used too much force, or a solvent mixture or detergent or soap that was inappropriate. And so it took off some of that top layer of paint. And this top layer of paint was probably really thin and more susceptible to being removed, but that doesn't mean that it should be removed or that it was okay. So I'm trying to just address this damage so that it's not so visible and so problematic for the painting. We can't undo the damage, but maybe we can make it less visible. And with that final bit of retouching, all the work is complete. We don't need to apply a final varnish because we did that before the retouching, and everything is archival, so it's going to last. Now, seeing this painting with the old varnish removed, the flaking paint stabilized, all of that excessive overpaint gone, and enlarged to its original size, well, it's a different painting than it was before. Seeing it free of damage, both in the sky and on the horse, allows us to see the image and not focus on all of those problems. In addition, enlarging the painting to its proper size, the size that Berninghaus created, it matters. Not only because it's our responsibility to honor the work of the artist, but because even as little as 1 inch expansion of the image can change how we see it, can change the framing of the scene, and that matters. And frankly, whether or not we see it as important, it is, because that's how the painting was born. And so seeing this scene now, as Berninghaus envisioned it, as he saw it when he fell in love with the Southwest and the Taos, well, it kind of takes us back to another place. And we can imagine the lives of these people. When the painting arrived at the studio, it was not a disaster. It actually looked pretty good. But there were opportunities to make it better, to make it more stable, to make it itself, to return it back to the state that it was when Berninghaus created it, not just in the way it looks, but in its physical size. And now, seeing it returned, we can imagine Berninghaus coming across the Taos in winter and seeing this scene and falling in love with it. And though this painting is no longer in the Southwest, I'm sure it will be treasured in whichever home it ends up in.